making dried apples today, which is one of my very favorite ways to preserve apples and one of my favorite things to eat throughout the winter. Now, there's a lot of different ways that you can prepare apples for dehydrating. There's different ways that you can cut them and different techniques for seasoning them, and I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different ways so that you can pick and choose which one works best for you based on your goals and the equipment that you have. As far as what type to use, I have never met an apple that didn't dry well, so use whatever you have available. It's a great way to use up apples that tend to be mealy or that don't last very long in storage. Of course, the better they taste, the sweeter they are, the better dried they're going to be too. First, you'll need to decide if you want to peel your apples or not. The peels actually have a lot of nutrition, including fiber, and it's also where most of the apple's flavor is, so I like to leave them on. I don't mind peels even dried. However, if they were sprayed with chemicals, the skin is where that'll be most concentrated. So my personal rule of thumb is that if we grew the apples or a friend did and I know they weren't sprayed, I leave the peel on. If the apples are from like a grocery store, I tend to peel them, but it's up to you. Let's start with round apple slices. I first and foremost always remove the core. You can do that before or after you cut them into slices. And I really love this handy dandy core. You plunge it in to the apple and then it pops the core out. Mine is a little bit old, so it's not as sharp as it used to be, but it still works pretty well. You just plunge it into the apple, which takes a little bit of a force. And then once you pull it out, the core is inside, and you use the little lever thing to just pop it right out. And then you have a beautifully, perfectly cored apple ready for slicing. For cutting them into round slices, you can either use a mandolin or a knife. A mandolin is really great if you want thin, uniform slices, which, to be honest, are really lovely. The downside to using a mandolin is that they can be dangerous. Of course, you should always use a guard if you're going to use one, but look at how beautiful these slices are. One negative to making really thin slices like this is that they take up so much room on the tray, so this is not a good option if you have, say, an entire bushel of apples that need dehydrating. And if you don't have a fancy core remover and you don't have a mandolin, you can actually just use a good old-fashioned knife. It works really well too. You don't need anything special for preparing apples for the dehydrator. Of course, with a knife, you won't be able to get them as uniform as you could with a mandolin, but that does not matter at all. Don't worry about that. You can cut them as thin or as thick as you like. I'd say about 1/4 inch is the upper end of thickness that I'd go. Now, to remove the cores from the slices, I like a little cookie cutter. This one is probably bigger than it should be and is removing more apple than I'd actually like it to, but it's just so cute. I think a star or a heart would also be really adorable. You can also use a little metal tip from a pastry bag if you have one of those, although it doesn't work quite as well. And if you have thinner slices, you can stack up a few and punch a bunch all at once. No matter which slicing technique you're using, get your apples into the dehydrator as soon as you can. I only work one tray at a time, so as soon as I have one tray filled, you can see they're browning a little bit here, I get them into the dehydrator right away before starting another tray. Sometimes I leave my apples plain, and sometimes I like to season them with either cinnamon or apple pie spice, and you only need to do one side. I think the easiest way to do this if you have round slices is to carefully, finessefully, gently tap some out of a shaker bottle, and a little bit goes a long way. Do not overdo it with the spices here. All right, let's move on to something that is not a round slice, like wedges, which are probably my favorite way to do apple slices if I have a lot to work through and I'm not peeling them. I start by cutting the big slabs off of the sides, and then I cut the strips that are left. Of course, the core gets tossed, and then the strips I cut in half. And then the slabs I cut into slices, and the average I'd say is probably 5 slices depending on the size of the apple, but anywhere from 4 to 6 is typical. You can definitely cut these thinner if you like a thinner, crispier dried apple. The thicker they are, the chewier they tend to be. I like them both ways. This is definitely my favorite way to prepare them for making one of my favorite things, which is maple apple pie seasoned apples, which I'm going to show you next. This is a really simple, easy way to elevate your dried apples. I just pile all the slices into a bowl, and then I sprinkle on a mixture of maple sugar, cinnamon, and apple pie spices, and then I just keep tumbling them all around until they're evenly coated. The ratio that I always use that I like is 1 tablespoon of maple sugar, 1/4 teaspoon of cinnamon, and 1/4 teaspoon of apple pie spices. You could substitute brown sugar for the maple sugar if you don't have it, but it is really, really delicious. And while the apples don't really need sugar, it is just a little bit and it turns them into an extra special treat. I like just a really light layer, although you can use as much or as little as you want. I tend to add a little bit, and if it looks like it's not enough, I'll add a little bit more. I think this is perfect. And now we'll just get them onto the tray and get them sorted out. For dehydrating apples, they should not be overlapping, but it is okay if they're touching. They're going to start to shrink right away once they dehydrate, and if they're touching now, they won't be touching for long. The last cutting method I want to talk about is using a Johnny apple peeler. At least that's what mine is called. This is a really handy way to work through a lot of apples quickly, especially if you want to peel them. It works pretty slick. You just stick the apple onto the prongs, turn the handle, and it sends it through a peeler and a slicer. I will say this only works well if you have pretty firm apples. If you try to put a mealy or a softer apple through this, it'll just kind of crumble and break apart and not work very well. But when it does work, it works awesome. You slide the apple off and it is a beautiful accordion cut. Look at how fun that is. Then you can just take the whole thing and cut it in half with a knife, and you end up with really beautiful, really uniform slices. I also think that these end up a really lovely thickness for dried apples. And into the dehydrator they go. My machine has a fruit setting, which is around 135 degrees, which is my preferred temperature for dehydrating apples. That temperature will help to deactivate enzymes that would otherwise cause them to deteriorate in storage, and this way they last a really long time, like over a year in just the pantry. And so how long do they take? Well, I always say that they're going to take as long as they're going to take. The thinner slices will actually only take maybe like 6 hours, but the thicker ones will need more like 24. Just make sure they don't feel wet. They will be a little bit more pliable when they're still warm in the machine, but as soon as they cool off, they will turn harder and crispier. Especially if they're thin cut like this. This is a really nice way to cut them if you have kids, because I think they're really easy to eat. They're super crisp, and the peels are so thin that they really just go unnoticed. It's worth noting that while dried apples are more crisp when they're first done, as they sit over time, they can soak up moisture from the environment and become soft, even in a closed container. And then here are the thicker ones. These are the ones I sliced by hand with a knife and used the cookie cutter to cut out the middle. They're also pretty snappy and pretty crisp. I think these are a nice option if you like the look of a round apple slice, but you have more apples to get through and you want to use your dehydrator tray space just a little bit more wisely. And then over on this tray are the wedges. These are the slices that I seasoned with maple sugar and cinnamon and apple pie spice. And you can see they have a little bit thicker skin on them, thicker pieces of skin, which I really don't mind at all. It doesn't bother me. And these ones were also the thickest apples that I sliced, and you can tell they're not as snappy, they're not as crisp. They have a little bit softer, more chewy texture. And then last are the ones that I cut with the Johnny apple peeler. The one thing that I don't love about these is that they are a little bit brown, and that's because that peeler, I think, bruises the fruit a little bit with the force and the fact that it's probably a little bit duller than my knife or the mandolin, but it really doesn't affect the flavor, so I honestly don't mind, and they're a really lovely texture and a really nice thickness. And now that you know a lot of different ways to cut and season apples for drying, you can mix and match all of those techniques depending on your skill and your equipment and your goals. And one more thing I wanted to mention, this is what an apple slice looks like if you don't remove the core. And while it is really beautiful, it has a natural star shape, it has these really hard pieces in the center that hold the seeds in. And as pretty as they are, unfortunately, I just don't enjoy eating them like this. For storage, I keep them in airtight glass jars just in the pantry, where they will last for a very long time, at least a year or more. And that is dried apples in about 100 different ways. Let me know if you have any questions, and if you found this video helpful, I would love it if you could give it a thumbs up, and make sure to subscribe to my channel so that you are the first to know whenever a new video is posted.